The early morning air at Windsor Castle had a strange chill, unexpected for the season, but not unwelcome. It bit gently at the skin, coaxing tourists to wrap their jackets tighter as they gathered in hushed excitement for the changing of the guard. The age-old ritual, a symbol of continuity and royal dignity, had long drawn visitors from around the globe. Children perched on their parents' shoulders, couples snapped photos, and guides quietly narrated the significance of the ceremony. Standing amid the grandeur was Guard James Mitchell. Clad in the iconic scarlet uniform of the Queen's Guard, he was the embodiment of silent strength. His posture was flawless, each crease in his uniform sharp as a blade, each brass button polished to a mirror shine. He was motionless, his eyes locked forward, but his mind was alert. Mitchell was no mere ceremonial fixture, he was a seasoned soldier. 8 years of military service in conflict zones like Iraq and Afghanistan had. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below to let me know which country you're watching from. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. The crowd shifted uneasily. Parents gently moved their children behind them. Elderly tourists lowered their cameras, no longer interested in capturing what was clearly becoming something far darker than tradition. Trained him to recognize danger, even in peace, that instinct stirred the moment he heard the distant growl of a motorcycle engine. Unlike the friendly hum of a tourist's bike, this sound was harsher, darker, like a beast waking up. It split through the murmurs of the crowd, demanding attention with its unnatural snarl. Mitchell did not flinch, but his senses locked onto the sound, tracking it as it drew nearer. He didn't need to look to know that trouble was approaching. Then the machine appeared. It was a black monstrosity of chrome and steel, with handlebars adorned in crude skulls and a gas tank painted in twisted Nordic runes. What had once been ancient symbols of culture and strength had been rebranded into dark emblems of hate. The rider matched the bike, massive, imposing, and draped in a leather vest that strained against his bulk. Steel-capped boots hit the stone pavement with deliberate menace, and each step radiated provocation. As the biker dismounted, the atmosphere in the courtyard shifted. Laughter faded. Conversation stalled. A quiet unease settled over the crowd. This was not a tourist, he was a statement, a challenge wrapped in arrogance. His vest bore patches that echoed the symbols of long-defeated ideologies. Around his neck hung a crude imitation of an iron cross, not a military honor, but a mockery of one. This man had not come to admire history, he had come to desecrate it. With gravel in his voice and a sneer on his lips, the biker strode toward Guard Mitchell. Well, the biker growled, circling the immobile guard. His voice was soaked in contempt and rasped from years of cigarettes and cruelty. Look what we got here. Standing all pretty in your fancy uniform. The biker's presence was a storm cloud over the bright morning, and everyone could feel the static building in the air. Guard Mitchell remained motionless, every inch the disciplined soldier. He had faced real threats, men armed with guns, driven by hatred, chaos, or fear. He knew this kind of behavior well. It was the posture of those who confused intimidation for power. Yet he did not respond. His oath, his role, and his training demanded composure. You know what I see when I look at you? The biker snarled, stepping closer. His shadow loomed across Mitchell's boots like an omen. I see everything that's wrong with this world. All this tradition. All this order. He gestured with scorn at the castle around them. His fingers, thick and scarred, flexed unconsciously. Each knuckle bore a symbol, twisted runes, echoing ideologies long since crushed by the weight of history. The crowd began to back away, tension crackling like static. Yet Mitchell stood firm, a living monument to composure. You people, always hiding behind uniforms and rules, the biker scoffed. Afraid to face real men, one-on-one. Mitchell's eyes remained forward, but his awareness sharpened. Every shift in the biker's weight, every slight twitch of his fingers, Mitchell catalogued them with the precision of someone who had survived ambushes and firefights. He wasn't just watching. He was reading the situation like a book written in body language and danger. The biker's voice rose as he taunted the guard, his words crafted not for response, but for humiliation. "I've been watching you lot. Standing here day after day, playing dress-up soldier while the real world laughs at you." Still, Mitchell did not react. His silence was a mirror, reflecting back the biker's insecurity. But it also fed his rage. Finally, with a violent burst of motion, the biker acted. With speed that belied his bulk, he lunged and shoved guard Mitchell with all his strength. The impact rang out against the stone courtyard. Mitchell's boots scraped across the ancient stones, his rifle tipping as he staggered. For the first time, the perfection of his posture faltered. He fell, the crowd gasped. Phones dropped. A child began to cry. And the biker laughed, a cruel, victorious sound that echoed off the castle walls. He raised his arms in triumph, reveling in the humiliation he believed he had inflicted, but what he didn't see, what the crowd didn't yet realize, was that this fall wasn't the end, it was the turning point. Guard Mitchell's fall wasn't theatrical. There was no dramatic slow motion, no anguished cry, just the clean, hard truth of body meeting stone. His ceremonial rifle clattered against the pavement, echoing across the courtyard like a challenge. For the first time, the red-clad sentinel who had stood like a statue now lay grounded, his uniform stained with the dust of history. The biker howled in triumph, raising his fists as if conquering an enemy rather than disgracing a tradition. He strutted, drunk on dominance, casting a shadow that now seemed even more menacing against the fallen guard. "Not so perfect now, are you?" he shouted, the words slicing through the silence. The crowd stood frozen, some in shock, others in fear. A few instinctively stepped forward, only to be held back by the weight of uncertainty. Would intervening worsen things? A child clung to his mother's leg, eyes wide with confusion. A tourist's camera dangled forgotten from his wrist. The biker turned his back to the motionless Mitchell, raising his arms once again, this time like a preacher before a congregation. His voice became a weapon, laced with propaganda, ignorance, and a twisted sense of pride. This is what happens when you worship weakness. When you put faith in uniforms, in ceremony. But beneath the biker's feet, something shifted. Unseen by him, the man he believed defeated was stirring. Guard Mitchell had been down for exactly 3 seconds. In those brief seconds, something within him had changed, or perhaps, something had been released. The blank expression meant for ceremony had given way to a different gaze, one forged in the furnace of real conflict. His eyes, once fixed forward with discipline, now burned with precise calculation. He wasn't just a guardsman anymore, he was a soldier. As the biker ranted to the crowd, spewing distorted ideals and revisionist glory, he committed the cardinal sin of any battlefield. He turned his back on the enemy. He had mistaken silence for weakness. He had mistaken restraint for fear, and now, that mistake was about to cost him. In the space between the biker's final triumphant word and the next heartbeat, Guard Mitchell rose. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand gesture, no roar of vengeance. It was silent, measured, a predator returning to its feet with the inevitability of a closing trap. Mitchell's white-gloved hand reached out, and with unerring precision, clamped onto the biker's shoulder. The effect was immediate. The biker's face contorted in sudden, sharp pain. The grip was more than strong, it was perfect. Not the brutish grab of a bar fighter, but the trained application of leverage and pressure points. Years of close combat drills, of sparring with professionals and detaining actual combatants, had taught Mitchell exactly how to break a man down with the least motion possible. Before the biker could fully turn, before his surprise could even manifest as a defense, Mitchell executed a flawless hip throw. The giant man, who had so confidently strutted across sacred ground, was lifted and slammed onto the ancient stones with the finality of a gavel strike. The crowd gasped, not in fear this time, but in awe. A child whispered. He got up, and the reverence in that voice was unmistakable. Mitchell stood over the biker, his boot pressed firmly against the man's chest. Not enough to injure, but enough to deliver a message. You are no longer in control. The white gloves that had not even smudged during the fall gripped his belt with silent confidence. The steel toe of his boot gleamed in the sunlight as if mocking the biker's earlier bravado. All the noise the biker had brought with him, the rants, the arrogance, the mockery, was now gone. Only silence remained. Mitchell's voice, when it came, was quiet. Steady. Heavy with authority not given, but earned. Go ahead, he said. Test your real strength now. The biker writhed beneath him, trying to buck the weight off. But every movement was met with tactical adjustments, minute shifts in boot placement, pressure applied just so. The biker wasn't being crushed, he was being controlled. Completely. Efficiently. Mercilessly. You think power comes from fear, Mitchell continued, pressing a little harder until the man's breath caught. You think strength is measured by how loud you shout, how many symbols you wear, or how many people you scare. A bead of sweat rolled down the biker's forehead. He tried to twist away. Futile, you don't know anything about strength. Not the kind that protects. Not the kind that stands firm when it's easier to walk away. And then, the most damning words of all. You mistook ceremony for softness. You mistook my silence for surrender. And you thought discipline meant I'd forgotten how to fight. The crowd, which had been frozen in silent awe, now seemed transfixed. The biker, once a towering figure of menace, lay trapped under the polished toe of a man he had thought ornamental, not operational. Everything had changed in seconds. The narrative had flipped. The villain had been unmasked. The soldier had risen, the courtyard was silent now. Even the birds, so accustomed to fluttering and chirping through Windsor's morning air, seemed to have paused to witness what unfolded. Guard Mitchell didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm words, spoken with the weight of lived experience, cut deeper than any shout. You worship chaos, he said, eyes locked onto the biker's panicked face. You think strength is domination. That violence makes a man. But strength without restraint? That's not power. That's cowardice wearing a mask. The biker grunted beneath the guard's boot, his earlier arrogance now splintering into disbelief. He tried again to twist out from under Mitchell's hold, but every shift in muscle was met with perfectly timed counter-pressure, a knee, a hand, a boot heel, all applied not with rage, but with professional exactness. Let me explain something. Mitchell continued. This uniform, this brass, this posture you mocked, it's not about show. It's about honor. About discipline. The kind of discipline your kind has always feared. Because it doesn't break when stared down. It stands. The biker's gaze flicked toward the crowd. No sympathy. No allies. Just wide eyes and stunned faces. His symbols, once worn like armor, now looked meaningless, empty relics on a man laid bare. Mitchell pressed slightly harder, enough to remind him who was in control. This boot, he said, voice steady, could break your ribs right now. And I wouldn't be out of line. But I won't. Because real power isn't about what you can destroy. It's about what you choose not to. The biker's breath was now shallow. Sweat mingled with dirt on his face. His limbs were stiff from resistance and fatigue. The strength he had taken such pride in was nothing against the training of someone who had spent years mastering every inch of his body in combat. You thought the past had faded, Mitchell said, his eyes dark with memory. You thought people forgot. That the values you spit on, order, respect, service, had grown weak. He leaned in, his voice now barely above a whisper. You're wrong. The biker's lips parted, trying to form words, excuses, rage, denials, but none came. Only a gasp of disbelief. He looked up at the man he had once mocked, and finally saw what he was really facing, not a ceremonial guard, a soldier, and not just any soldier, one forged in war, wrapped in history, and shielded by purpose. Mitchell didn't move, didn't shift even slightly as two police officers rushed into the courtyard. Their quick, professional steps announced them before they spoke. One glance at the pinned biker, and the unmistakable patches on his vest, told them everything: assault on a Queen's Guard. One officer said. His tone was cold, clipped. That's a serious offense. The word "sir" came next, but not as a courtesy. It was hollow, a label spat with contempt. They weren't speaking to a citizen, they were addressing a criminal steeped in hate. Mitchell's foot eased off just slightly, enough to allow the officers access, but his eyes never left the biker's face. He chose to test what he didn't understand, he said quietly. Let him face the consequences. The biker was hauled to his feet by the officers. He stumbled, legs unsure. The man who had stomped across sacred ground minutes before now looked deflated, small. His boots, which once struck the pavement with the weight of menace, now scraped awkwardly against the stone, a sound of retreat, not defiance. As the officers began to lead him away, one paused to look at Mitchell. Thank you for your restraint, he said. Mitchell simply nodded. An older man stepped from the crowd, the Royal Marines veteran who had watched silently before. He came to attention, campaign medals glinting in the light, and offered a crisp salute. Royal Marines. 82 to 95, he said. Good to see the standards haven't dropped. Mitchell, eyes still forward, returned the gesture with the smallest motion of his head. No words were exchanged, they weren't needed. Between soldiers, understanding often travels silently. The tension in the air eased. Tourists began to breathe again. A mother clutched her children a little tighter. A guide resumed his description of Windsor's battlements, though his voice now carried a hint of reverence. The symbols on the biker's vest, symbols once worn to intimidate, now seemed laughable in contrast to what had truly prevailed. The day continued. Tourists would come and go, unaware of what had happened that morning. But those who had stood in that courtyard, those who had seen, left changed. Not just with stories or phone footage, but with respect. Respect for what that uniform represented, and respect for the man inside it. As the crowd slowly dispersed from the courtyard of Windsor Castle, the morning sun now felt warmer, less tense, as if the storm had passed. A few lingered, reluctant to leave, still under the spell of what they had witnessed. They had come to see pageantry, to take pictures of marching boots and shining helmets. What they had seen instead was a glimpse of the steel beneath the ceremony, the unshakable core of the men behind the uniform. The cobblestones where the confrontation had taken place now stood quiet, save for the echo of retreating footsteps and the faint hum of a street sweeper brushing away the scuffs of combat. The biker's discarded ideology, once screamed at the top of his lungs, now seemed as weightless as the dust being carried off the ground. No monument would be built for him. No memory would honor his cause, but Guard Mitchell remained. He stood again at his post, the red of his coat somehow brighter, the rifle in his hands once more perfectly aligned. Tourists who had missed the event wouldn't know what had just occurred. They would only see a silent, disciplined figure guarding tradition. But for those who had been there, the child who had asked why is that man so angry? The veteran who had saluted, the mothers who had stepped between danger and their children, that image now carried a gravity that words could barely capture. Because now they understood, the uniform wasn't just fabric and brass, it was memory, of battles fought and won, of freedom defended not just with weapons, but with values. It was commitment to centuries-old traditions that still held the line in a world often too eager to forget them, and it was strength, not the kind that roars, but the kind that endures. The kind that stands when pushed. That responds not with chaos, but with calm, focused, righteous action. Guard Mitchell had never wanted to become the center of attention. He was a man of silence and service, trained to do his duty regardless of who was watching. But in that single, unforgettable encounter, he became the living embodiment of what it means to protect more than a location, to guard an ideal, the ideal that strength without discipline is meaningless, that ceremony without purpose is hollow, and that the men and women behind the rituals of royalty are not relics, they are guardians. So the next time a passerby sees a Queen's Guard standing motionless at their post, They may chuckle, or wave, or try to distract him for amusement. But those who saw what happened that day at Windsor Castle will remember differently. They'll see the stillness not as obedience, but as restraint, as training, as a line quietly drawn in stone, one not easily crossed, because standing behind those polished boots, under that bearskin cap, is not a toy soldier, it's a warrior, a professional, a protector, and if challenged, if forced to show it, he will remind the world exactly what that means. As the last of the tourists faded into the winding paths around Windsor Castle, and the shadows stretched longer across the courtyard, a certain kind of stillness settled in. Not the lifeless quiet of indifference, but the solemn calm that follows a revelation, the kind that makes people walk slower, speak softer, and carry something intangible with them. For those who had stood witness, the lesson was clear: the Queen's Guard is not just a symbol. He is not just a silent figure standing for photo ops or tradition. He is a sentinel, a professional, a soldier with history in his bones and resolve in his spine. What happened that morning was not merely an altercation. It was a collision of ideologies. One side brought arrogance, provocation, and the illusion that power comes from noise and brute force. The other stood for discipline, for honor, for the quiet strength that only those who have truly faced fear can carry with dignity. And when those two forces met, only one endured. Guard Mitchell did not speak of vengeance. He did not retaliate with hatred. He responded with training, with purpose, and with restraint, the kind that requires more courage than any punch ever thrown in anger. His was the strength that holds the line when others would break. The biker, so loud, so sure, so venomous in his beliefs, left the scene in disgrace, his hateful symbols dulled by the dust of defeat. But Mitchell, standing tall once again, left behind something that lingered far longer than the echoes of boots or chains or angry voices. He left behind a reminder that real strength is not loud, it is not crude. It does not shout in people's faces or dress itself in borrowed history. Real strength wears silence like armor. It stands unmoving in the face of mockery. It does not flinch when provoked, and it does not boast when victorious. What makes a uniform worthy of respect is not the shine of its buttons or the cut of its fabric. It's the character of the one who wears it. The kind of man who, even when shoved to the ground, rises with purpose rather than pride. Who uses his power not to crush, but to correct. Who can dismantle hatred not with fury, but with discipline. As the narrator's voice fades, one last thought remains: the next time you pass by a Queen's Guard, remember this: behind the stillness, behind the red coat and the motionless stare, stands a soldier trained for war, prepared for peace, and committed to something far greater than himself. A man who does not merely represent tradition. He defends it. Silently. Relentlessly. And with all the strength the world hopes never needs to be shown again. As the bells of Windsor chimed softly in the background, the final chapter of that extraordinary morning settled into memory. The stones had fallen silent again. The castle resumed its usual rhythm. The tourists came and went, some unaware of what had transpired. But for those who had witnessed it, for those who had felt the tremor of tension and the quiet triumph that followed, something had changed. They had not just seen a confrontation, they had seen a defining moment, a test of values played out not on a battlefield, but in a ceremonial square. A clash between noise and purpose, between chaos and conviction. It was, in every sense, a reminder that some uniforms are not worn for show, but for service. That some men do not speak because they are trained to act. And that tradition, when carried by the right hands, is not a relic, it is a shield. The Queen's Guard had returned to his post. No scars were visible. No celebration was made. There was no announcement, no medal awarded in that moment. Just the quiet act of resuming duty. And yet, within that silence, something profound echoed, because the greatest victories are not always declared with banners. Sometimes, they are marked by the simple act of standing back up. Guard Mitchell stood not only for the crown that day. He stood for the principle that discipline outlasts aggression, that real power lies not in overpowering others, but in rising without needing to crush. He represented the strength of a nation, the dignity of those who serve, and the enduring truth that ceremony, when upheld with honor, becomes a fortress in itself. The biker's name would fade, forgotten as all who stand on hate eventually are. But the memory of the guard, steadfast, unbroken, precise, would linger in the minds of those who saw him rise, and somewhere, perhaps in another time, another place, when a child watches a silent soldier at their post and asks, "Why doesn't he move?" a parent who stood in that courtyard might kneel and whisper, "Because sometimes, the strongest men don't need to." In an age that often rewards volume over virtue, there is something sacred about the quiet professional. Something noble in those who guard not just borders, but values. The Queen's Guard may not speak, but in moments like these, he does not need to. His silence says everything. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.